democracy is not limited to the local and the direct through fraternity. Instead, I will propose that it is fueled by the social influences that individuals have. I will theorize that people are socially informed and, as part of this, are formed by social norms that they are in contact with. Further, with the rapidly expanding sphere of social influence, the idea of democracy being limited to the local may be true, but the local and the national are in many ways synonymous when it comes to the socialization of the modern individual. I will show that democracy is not limited to the fraternal relationship of democracy in a few key ways. First, I will go over Gregory Papa's interpretation of John Dewey's work on democracy and explain his conception of fraternity as a limiting factor to large democracies, hopefully constructing his work effectively. In the same section, I will introduce Papa's conception of how democracy can move past the limits of local fraternity and explain why he thinks that this is unreachable. Secondly, I will introduce the theoretical work of George Herbert Mead and explain how a sociological system offers the promise of transcending the boundaries of local identity. Thus, through his theoretical work, one can establish a research program to reconstruct democracy to tackle the problems of division in a large democratic project. In particular, I develop his idea of the socially informed me as both philosophically and sociologically revolutionary turn in paleopragmatism. I will do this by first showing that Mead's developed theory of the socially informed me has begun to see a resurgence in the 21st century sociological literature. I will go on to explain how this assists large democracies in staying interconnected between members of their population. Finally, I will explore a system of distance group formation that would allow for the socially informed self to be able to be formed as a national identity instead of just a local identity. So this begins my next section, entitled Papa's and Dewey's Thoughts on Limited Peaceful Democracy. Gregory Papas argues that pragmatic democracy should be based in the constant struggle in a local community as both the ends and the means to a lasting national democratic project. Papa's right supporting this point that the democratic condition is a constant struggle towards the ideal, and that the philosophy of democracy must take as its starting and end points of the present lived process and the struggle for democracy. What this means is that for Papa's, democracy is a constant and ongoing process over a long period of time. In this struggle, the ideal will never be reached. Nevertheless, the struggle towards the ideal is one that people must engage in for the good of democracy. And in the struggle for democracy, sorry, it seems that fraternity, being local and direct, is the limiting factor of national democracy in his theoretical work. Papa enforces this claim by writing that pragmatist ethics and politics, rather than being communitarian and interactionary, are based on ethics of democratic relationships. Pappas goes on to support the democratic character being local and anchored in the local context when he writes that the democratic character can only be developed in the context of the local community. Thus, the community should be local and physical, and that the people who are in this community should be in constant interaction with each other. The consequences of this is that the conception of democracy is that it will be limited by the number of interactions that humans can reasonably achieve in their community. Pappas does offer some optimism in his writing regarding the hope of a thriving large democratic community. He does this by arguing that an apparatus for what it would take to be a national democracy can be based on public considerations. Pappas writes first that the public is pluralistic, scattered, and mobile, and that for them to take charge, they must extend their ideas past local groups. Pappas puts it more concisely when he writes that in order for deep empathy with everyone in democracy to be formed, one must first experience their identity as that of a people, meaning that for persons to conceive of others as being a part of national democratic project, then they must be able to experience other people's identities in their own lives. The consequences of this is that citizens need to have a deep empathy for each other in the national arena in order for the context of the local community as a necessary condition for democracy to be moved into the future. The biggest hole in Papa's arguments comes in response to the objections that he anticipates. This is shown in Papa's theorizing. He only engages with political theory literature and fails to engage with political science and sociological literature to support his criticisms of the limits of national democracy. Instead, he engages in these theoretical arguments and only discusses deliberative democracy and public reason liberalism. However, he does acknowledge that with theoretical framework and corresponding empirical research to verify those theoretical ideas that critique Papa's, limiting national democracy would be able to transcend the context of the local community and inspire national cooperation and peace. My next section is entitled Papa's Objection Being Solved Theoretically in Mead's Work. George Herbert Mead understood the complexity of social interaction at a larger level than Papas and Dewey's did, because of his sociological background. Because of his understanding of sociological phenomena at a larger level, Mead's understanding of how groups interacted and his optimism to the realization of sympathy between individuals around the world allowed for Mead's work to be a useful tool and a theoretical framework to refute the concepts that were originally provided by Papas. The complexity of Mead's thought and the potential for individuals to reach a global consciousness in Mead's work, Mind, Self, and Society, is realized. Mead acknowledges that human society in the early 20th century was composed of small groups, and most people simply remained inside of these small groups in their everyday lives. Mead, however, goes on to argue that the entire human species in the early 20th century is in the process towards struggling into a larger consciousness that encompasses that of all the human species. Humankind, according to Mead, has the potential to move past smaller communities and into larger consciousness, but first needs to work towards identifying with others in a deep way. Mead goes on to support this theory of international consciousness and potential solution to national consciousness when he argues that as a group extends to the national level, the me, or the socially constructed self, becomes more cosmopolitan in nature. The me in this concept is referring to the composition of Mead's conception of the I, or the self, through socialization that people exhibit when they are in large groups with each other. Some modern sociological theorists have labeled this the relational self, which essentially means that individuals in the formation of their identity tend to refer to outside actors as a point of reflection for their own identities. Mead then goes on to theorize that international mindedness will lead to social progress, which will be able to achieve international peace. Mead supports this claim by theorizing that the self-conscious human individual responds to the problem by applying the attitudes that they were socialized to. Essentially, this references back to the modern sociological conception of the relational self. Sorry, I lost my place for a sec. The consequence of the me and its modern counterpart to the relational self is that the human individual being socialized to the environment means that if humans spend enough time in the national environment, then they will become socialized to the needs of everyone else in that environment. Then I move on to the empirical support for Mead's sociological conclusions. So Mead's work has had a somewhat limited impact in the 21st century, although it has begun to make a comeback in regards to the way that Mead conceptualizes the erasure of the divide between the private and public spheres, and the social identity being a complex formation of both of these concepts together into a single experience. Specifically, Mead's theory has been used by Nathan Manning in his article, The Rational Self and the Political Engagement of Young Adults. In Manning's article, he argues that the dominant discourse of youth apathy and disengagement from politics relies upon a narrow notion of politics and sustains an abstract autonomous model of the self. In support of this thesis, Manning relies off of Mead's theory of the relational self as a basis of his sociological analysis of youth apathy and disengagement in politics. Specifically, Mead argues that in contemporary social life, we move between increasingly permeable public-private realms as social selves constructed in dialogue with particular generalized others. This seems to suggest that moving away from the public-private distinction in policymaking would be able to improve the amount of relationships that most people have with politics and possibly with democracy overall. Further, this relates to the me as being a socially informed, self-supporting self, the arguments for the erasure of the public-private distinction. Manning supports his argument for the erasure of the public-private distinction through interview-based research, where he conducts interviews of groups of students, asks them to discuss their political affiliation and their lives that relate to these political affiliations. In this discussion with the subjects, he noticed that subjects seemed to emphasize the importance of friends as interlocutors for political discussion, mentors, and as helping to sustain political commitments. What can be gleaned from this is that the socialized other is an important part of how the formation of political identity is created. Manning went on to conclude from his study that the political views and practices of subjects seem to be a product of family and friendships developing around significant life events over significant periods of time. From this, Manning learned that these individuals are socially embedded versions of the self. Manning does add a caveat, however, to this discussion in arguing that it is important to emphasize individual political acts as being meaningful only so far as they are able to link people together. This may even mean linking people through vast networks of trade and production. Ultimately, this relates back to Mead, because Mead concludes drawing upon, I'm sorry, this is Mead attunes scholars to a symbolic interactionalist view that social institutions are made up of individuals acting in patterns ways. So Manning wrote this, not Mead, sorry. This shows an exciting connection between Mead's theoretical work and the empirical research that Manning conducted. Manning's work and its connection to Mead's theoretical framework creates hope for large democracies to be able to overcome the kind of division that has plagued the United States for a long time. Further, it is an excellent modern application of Mead's work for the promise of a stronger national democracy. Essentially, the application is that allowing for spheres where individuals can use their private identities to construct their public selves is conducive to higher political participation. Further, conceptualizing that individuals' acts are only meaningful so as far as they're able to assist in community ties shows that the importance of the community as a part of forming democracy is paramount, and that this must be sufficiently funded in government policies. Next, I move on to kind of an empirical framework entitled Electronic Spheres of Political Dialogue as Bridging Divides Between Groups. Spheres of political dialogue are important to be able to fix the problems that are apparent in democratic divisions, as is apparent in the wake of the 2021 storming of the United States Capitol building. The best way to accomplish this is to reflect back on the research that was conducted by Manning and push for applications of the erasure of the public-private distinction in policy circles. The best way to accomplish this is to use public funds to create community dialogue and national dialogue through these community organizations. I see the best way to do this is to create a multi-level system of community dialogue that incorporates individuals into open socialization and dialogue with each other across the country by electronic means that have become prevalent during the COVID-19 crisis. The best way I see of doing this is to strengthen the local community's ties so that citizens get used to seeing themselves as a community, like Mead theorized about. This should solve the community activities where individuals can start to see themselves instead of members of family groups, or solely as individuals, as socially informed individuals whose sense of who they are and morality is informed by the national community around them. However, I do want to offer a clarifying point. The local community should not be overemphasized in the manner in which Pappas was discussing. I do acknowledge that community is important. However, I do not think that local community is the only community that is important to the creation and solidification of a stable democracy. The overemphasis of the local could lead to further entrenchment of identities as being local. Also, the overemphasis of the local can increase polarization that results in the kind of violence that was seen at the American Capitol steps on January 6, 2021. Meaning that local communities should not be seen as the starting and end points of the present lived process and the struggle for democracy, as Pappas wrote. I believe this would cause the same kind of group identities that led to the collapse of democracy, that can lead to the collapse of democracy quickly and suddenly. To solve this problem, national community ties should be quickly incorporated into the dialogue that reaches across the country. This would mean creating an online community dialogue system that would effectively create ties and empathy across a large, diverse community. Zoom, WebEx, and Skype, similar to what we're doing right now, are examples of technology that would be able to achieve these large-reaching goals. As most people know, the effectiveness of literacy of these technologies over the last few years has vastly improved. What has been little explored, though, is the practical application of these specific technologies to create communities of individuals over a diverse and pluralistic country. One way that people can move to form community over great distances and with diverse conditions is seen in the initial efforts in distance learning. This phenomenon is documented by the authors of Community Development Among Distance Learners, Temporal and Technological Dimensions. The study was conducted by a group of researchers in the computer science field that concluded online communities are of equal value as most other communities. This was, of course, made on the caveat that community can be defined as activities that people do together. The specific activities that assist in the formations of communities are email network, news groups, and chat rooms. Remembering this was written in 2000, so it's a little older. The implication that comes from the 21 years of change is that we have a broadening level of technologies. That means that this community was able to be achieved through this limited apparatus, then it can be achieved at an even more effective level with Zoom, WebEx, and Skype. The best ways to create this national community through technological means is a two-tiered approach, as was observed in the community development among distance learner studies. Most programs need to start with a boot camp type activity to kick off the relationship between individuals. I imagine that the best way to do this would be to have a kind of national boot camp where individuals come together across the country to be able to work together as soon as they turn voting age. The process of this would be in person to kind of kick off those initial in-person bonds. And from there, once the program is established, then the second part would have repeated meetings over the internet between these individuals as they mature into adulthood, where they can play games, watch a movie, or other fun activities, and then they go on to discuss it. This would continue the process of creating a socially informed self, or as Mead would call it, a me, to be formed by the large representation of the citizens in the country. So in this article, I primarily responded to Gregory Papa's interpretation of John Dewey's Limits of Democracy. I did not do this by reinterpreting Dewey. Instead, I offered a different pragmatic framework to work off of, Mead's relational self. I then showed that this theory of Mead's is empirically verified through the work that was conducted by Manning and his research on increasing voter participation. I then theorized that achieving community at the national level through a measured program of fostering national community. The implication of this is that the type of situations that resulted in 2021 insurrection at the United States Capitol can be avoided in the future if the United States federal government adopts a measured approach to create socially informed selves across the country. It is possible that individuals will raise the objection that this may lead to the type of hypernationalism and nativism that was seen in the United States during the 1910s through the 1950s. However, I believe that local and national community will help develop a diversity of views for individuals to adhere to, and thus undermine that objection. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Pierce. Do we have any questions, folks? Please type in the chat if you do. Okay. Gail, I see you typed a question. Do you want to ask that? Or Meredith?
I could ask my question. You sounded so optimistic. Wouldn't it be great? But what you were reminding me of is when I go out in Detroit, where all my neighbors have like Biden signs on their lawns for the last 6 months, and then I drive for an hour to my other relatives where everyone has Trump signs on their lawn, and it's very geographic and it's very local, and everyone in those geographic localities reinforces each other instead of what we might say appealing to what we might call the facts about the election or the facts about this or that. And I do think that we need to talk about everyone getting on the same page and everybody learning the facts so that there isn't this division. But if we try to do that, won't the other side charge us with being a socialist boot camp that wants everyone to march step according to a certain idea? How will your ideas really bring people together in this divided time? I hope you're right, but I'm worried about whether it would really work.
Pierce, do you have an answer?
Yeah, thank you. I was just making sure it was cutting out a little bit, so I didn't know if she was done or not. Yeah, so I think bringing it together it's a difficult sell for sure to policymakers, especially with the objection that it's going to be some kind of along those lines. But it isn't a value-laden activity, I guess. It would be basically just taking young adults from across the country, putting them into an environment together and establishing social ties in that environment. So the program wouldn't be about like forming necessarily some kind of hyper-nationalist account or socialist account. It would be mostly about playing, I guess, more innocent ideas and interactions. So having activities that they'd be able to come together. It's really weird. The thought that immediately occurred to me was like summer camp. I don't know why, but like when you interact with people at summer camp, you form bonds and then you leave, but at times now you stay in communication. So, doing something like that, but at a national level where we can begin to relate across socioeconomic, across demographic lines, then we might be able to have a socially informed self that has a deeper level of empathy instead of such deep divisions as we see in the current conservatives or really Trumpers versus what's left of the Democrats. And so I think what's really important is kind of what, if any of you saw Dakota's talk yesterday, he discussed education briefly, is we do have to start with the youth now, but this is only part of the answer. We do also have to have a different kind of democratic system to be able to operate with individuals that are already polarized. So I think this is a part of the answer to the question, but not the complete answer.
I think we have time for one more question. Meredith?
I'd like to defer to Sarah.
Okay, sure. Sarah?
Oh, is that me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry. I didn't understand the protocol.
Not a problem.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, so I'm just wondering how your suggestion differs from organizations that already exist to bring people from across the country together, working together and building an identity and bonds like the military, like National Guard, even something like Boy Scouts or Girl Scouts that starts younger. Like, does this work to create kind of like a community that you're talking about? Or is that too nationalized? Is that too, something else going on there? So yeah.
Yeah, so I was a part of a JROTC program when I was at high school, and I remember that we would go to trainings over the summer. Uh, This is on higher national. My mother occasionally would make jokes. It was like the Hitler Youth, which was interesting, but it was that was troubling, and I think so. We need to move away from necessarily having like a hyper nationalistic value set, and instead it being about just interactions. So maybe something more like what the Boy Scouts do, but even then, I think there's certain value laden ideas of that are going on, and so yeah, that final part needs more work, but I think that the overall interaction between individuals is the most important part, and having that be as free as possible. And then the activities are engaging with really just being a time to interact with each other. Does that make sense, Sarah?
Yeah. So just not having an ideology of any kind associated with it, it sounds like. But okay. I'm also thinking too about like churches as well, like church communities, or like I'm just trying to think of all the different national social level groups or organizations that we already have, but they all seem to have some kind of ideological or belief set already in mind. And your idea is just completely free from that, it sounds like. So thank you. Thanks. That helps.
All right, folks, we're out of time, so let's give Pierce a hand. Thank you. And we're moving on to our second speaker, the eminence Bill Gay from Charlotte will give our next talk. And as usual, if you have a question, you don't have to type out the entire question. You can just write question in the chat and hopefully we'll get to you. And Bill, again, if at 18 minutes, I will give you a 2-minute warning. So without further ado, Bill Gay, folks.
Thank you. Bell Hooks, in her book, Teaching Community, A Pedagogy of Hope, writes, "Hopefulness empowers us to continue our work for justice, even as the forces of injustice may gain greater power for a time. Currently, many of us are feeling the threat of forces of injustice. The language used by Trump prior to the events of January the 6th, January 6, 2021, functioned to incite, to provoke, and to trigger. They exacerbated our dark times. They permitted, authorized, commanded the storming of the Capitol building. Our fears have been augmented about what could have occurred and what might yet occur. At the same time, focus on these words could divert us from words and actions of hope. The prompts of the language of hope are distinctive, particularly when they arise from a moral perspective that seeks to advance peace, justice, and nonviolence. Of course, seeking hope in dark times is not new. We have seen other references in this conference to the dark times in Arendt's a book, Men in Dark Times, written in 1968. Now, in our deeply polarized nation, dark times continues. And now, as always, our language makes a difference. My aim is going to be to address a discourse for peace activism for now and the future that presents hope from a moral perspective. We know some about hope, that it's not the same as faith or knowledge, that it's not blind or set in stone. In Greek, pistis is used for both faith and belief, and episteme or gnosis is used for knowledge, whereas elpis is used for hope and means something closer to expectation. Hope is between denial and resignation, the unthinkable and the unavoidable, the impossible and the inevitable. Hope makes action relevant. This possibility is greater than 0 and less than 1. Nevertheless, while possibility can ground hope, it does not necessarily sustain hope and may not even motivate it. For maintaining hope, I'm going to speak briefly about a couple of books in popular and literary approaches to hope, Rebecca Solnit and Terry Eagleton. And I'll also briefly say a few words about a couple of the philosophical texts on hopes, recent ones of Freire and Rorty and their respective ontological and pragmatic approaches. But what I'm going to turn to is lesser known work of Stephen Fishman on moral hope in John Dewey, and connect that with my work on linguistic nonviolence in what I'll advance as a performative discourse about hope. Some of you may know Rebecca Solnit's book, Hope in Dark Times, first released in 2004 and then expanded in 2016. And for maintaining hope, I think it's a good one for those who have gone weary. She cites many progressive victories and also notes that for those who are on the front lines or in the trenches, their work is arduous, relentless, and often an elusive quest. It can be frustratingly incremental work with demoralizing setbacks. I like it though, that despite all of this, she hints at a moral perspective when she writes, I believe in hope as an ongoing series of acts of defiance necessary to bring about some of what we hope for while we live by principle in the meantime. For those who are a little more despairing, perhaps who are truly damaged, I recommend Terry Eagleton's book published in 2015, Hope Without Optimism. He doesn't pull any punches and basically tells us something is better than nothing. He develops a concept of tragic hope, which is the strength to continue to the extent we can, even after profound and devastating loss. We may not fully recover from injury, from illness, from depression, but we may improve our conditions in our lives to some degree. So, well, that's not a lot of hope. As he says, something is better than nothing. Briefly, I also want to comment on Freire and on Rorty. Freire made hope central to his pedagogy. It says some about that in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, says hope is rooted in our incompletion. We move out in constant search, which can be carried out only in communion with others. But in his book, Pedagogy of Hope, while he tries to correct some of the oversights in Pedagogy of the Oppressed by noting that he also needed to address racial and gender oppression, He continues his more traditional Marxist stress on class, and he falls short of really achieving intersectionality and its stress on the interrelatedness of forms of oppression. Nevertheless, he does give us some more information on what he means by hope is an ontological need. He says hope is an ontological need, demands an anchoring in practice, hence the need for education in hope. And it's this theme of education in hope to which I will return later. Rorty, and many of us are familiar with what he wrote in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature, wanted to make a shift from philosophy as tied for a quest for accurate description of reality to philosophy as engaged in edifying discourse among philosophers. For me, the move from epistemology, we need to move from epistemology to social engagement, not to ivory tower edification. Rorty lets Dewey do less in Philosophy and Moral Hope, published in 1999, than he did with Wittgenstein and Heidegger in Philosophy in the Mirror of Nature. But whether they help, what matters, Dewey suggests, is not whether our ideas correspond to some fundamental reality, but whether they help us carry out our practical tasks and contribute to a more democratic society. Rorty's philosophy of hope no more captures reality than can any discourse. And what I see here is that such discourse may be edifying or practical for us, but it's not explicitly prescriptive for others. For this reason, I want to turn to a book by Steve Fishman, published in 2007, along with McCarthy, that provides a very useful theoretical and pedagogical analysis of Dewey's position on hope. Their analyses and applications of Dewey are something that goes beyond the methods of teaching championed by Freire and the style of conversation encouraged by Rorty. Fishman stresses that Dewey views life as characterized by suffering and uncertainty. Still, this worldly social reform remains possible. Fishman explores the conditions that Dewey thinks promote a life of hope as a moral perspective. Such hope is not self-sustaining. It needs to be cultivated. The affirmation of hope as a moral perspective can motivate, guide, sustain, and enrich our lives. Moral hope for Dewey involves holding fast to the prospect that good could win. Moral hope, Fishman also suggests, requires continuing affirmation of our ideals and use of our intelligence. Our hopes can be pronounced, he says, pronounced good on or moral upon moral reflection. Continues that hope makes powerful demands upon us, yet offers rich internal reward. What Fishman notes is that despite Dewey's social reform and Freire's social revolution and the differences between them, they both support democracy with the prospect that it have perpetual reform. Yet they also connect capitalism with colonialism and exploitation, and explicitly note that it's a disconnect with hope, especially for the exploited and disenfranchised masses. Whether hope is a native impulse or an instinct, for Dewey, we need to choose and cultivate among our biological options and maximize the prospects of hope that we find. I'm going to turn in this regard to talking about the moral perspective on hope as based on language games that involve performative discourse. Dewey and others give us a framework on hope, but they don't address per se the meaningfulness of a language of hope. I bring in the work of Ranjit Chatterjee on Wittgenstein's language games and use this as the foundation for my own view of hope as a moral perspective. Chatterjee turns to the Italian Marxist philosopher Ferruccio Rossilandi's work on Wittgenstein to argue that the meaning of an entire philosophy is found in the use we make of it. What I've been doing in my references so far is making use of some language games. What we find in Solnit, Eagleton, Freire, Reutte, and especially in Dewey and Fishman provide us with meaningful language games about hope. Of course, many other language games can authorize and motivate exit moves that prompt actions that it motivates and that it licenses. I'll give one example from Christy Simmons with respect to care ethics, which I think is an important model to consider. She writes, healthcare providers have an obligation to foster hope in their patients, and a feminist care ethics approach is best suited for this investigation. Many other examples could be given, and the constraints of the time will just let me give the names of some, like Martin Luther King Jr., Bell Hooks, Cornel West, Bishop Desmond Tutu, and more recently, the inaugural remarks of Joe Biden and the poem composed and read by Amanda Gorman. Language such as this can function to license and motivate efforts to help heal some of the divisions in the United States and elsewhere. The employment of the language of hope is performative. I have previously made use of the work of Lynn Terrell on speech acts in her analysis of the genocidal language games that were practiced in Rwanda. And she looks at the different entrance moves, internal moves, and exit moves from these languages. Negatively, speech acts can bring about physical and material changes in the world, including ones of physical violence. Terrell, like me, terms such speech as linguistic violence. And what she wants to do is to hold accountable not just the actors who go on to engage in physical violence, but also the authors of these words. I use her model of speech acts and actions that follow to turn from a negative to positive examples. We are being performative when we say something like, let us commit to these steps to try to advance social justice. We need messages of hope that employ linguistic nonviolence and provoke nonviolent action in the exit moves from them, whether those words are read or whether they are heard. So that we can have some time for discussion, I'm going to turn to my conclusion on viewing hope as a beacon and a motor. Moral hope includes proper performative discourse and the license actions that follow from it. Such discourse and action is more consistent and inspiring when guided by linguistic nonviolence and nonviolent social action. At the same time, we need to be mindful of what Etienne Balibar has warned about the prospects that we can lapse from these commitments and fall into not just linguistic violence, but also physical violence. I'm also reminded of the remark in terms of the quest that we face of remarks by Rossi Landi when he says that work toward the realization of our long-term hope and goals needs to be achieved in what he says, quote, the least possible number of centuries. So we've got a long road ahead of us. The message of the nonviolent movements of the 20th and into the 21st century serve as provide us with that hope is better than debilitating fear or reckless violence. We need the moral capital of a positive vision that can be provided by a language of hope from a moral perspective. The language games of hope that I have been describing also provide a moral compass. I can say, in trying to envision social justice, hope serves as a beacon. As a beacon, hope shines light on a goal that, while distant, is not a mere pipe dream. It is physically and socially possible state of affairs. I can also say, in deciding to undertake steps to advance social justice, hope is a motor. As a motor, Hope can provide motivation to take steps that aim to move us closer to the goal. The performative aspect of such utterances can serve to express a moral perspective to license and motivate actions that we regard as ones we should take. Such a language of moral hope, modeled on Fishman's Deweyan philosophy of hope, and in the use of care ethics within nursing and other areas of medicine, could become part of a language of politics that might be especially encouraging and motivating during this time of sharp and often acrimonious divisions in US politics. The language of hope, forged from a moral perspective, can become part of a language of linguistic nonviolence employed in the nonviolent quest for social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. All right, let's see. We have Andrew Fitzgibbon. Go ahead, Andrew.
Thanks, Bill. Enjoyed your paper as always. Bill, thinking about Dewey and Dewey's notion that belief is warranted assertability, what would you say hope is? Would it be warranted optimism or warranted positivity, or is hope ultimately unwarranted?
Well, I don't think Dewey would say that it's unwarranted, and I wouldn't say that it's unwarranted. Dewey comes close to saying that it's part of our, if you want to say it, instincts, our impulses. He wants to have it in a biological ground that he wants to see in a lot of life, an impulse to not just live, but to do better, or at least for humans. So in that sense, it is grounded in what we are as sentient beings. But he also stresses the struggle in which we are engaged, and that we have to make a commitment. But he says that if we stay with that commitment, that's when we can reap the rewards, at least for ourselves, in terms of the ideal toward which we are working and the continuing hope that further progress will be made.
Okay, Becky, I think you're next.
Yeah, thank you. Great paper. And wondering, I'm glad you bring up Amanda Gorman. I think she unleashed something. I've been following her. Her books are already sold out. There are 1 million prints now. And with Black Lives Matter, we've seen a lot of the Black authors, their work being out of print, not available, and publishers, have to do a lot to get those publications together. So that's, I find, very hopeful. And at the same time, that cuts again against the linguistic violence you hinted at, of looking at hate speech specifically, whether one should legislate that. Should we incentivize any linguistic games around hope? I'm just thinking sometimes with economic decision theory that, moving away from punishment in you don't will, incite us to do more of that negativity, right? But I'm wondering to what extent we need to look deeply into legislating, as from the German post Nazi experiment of basically curtailing free speech, right, and also executing the publisher of Der Stürmer, right, of fomenting such hatred that at the Nuremberg trial they thought that was not worthy. That was very much part and parcel of inciting people to the kind of violence that was instrumental in getting Germans to buy into the scheme.
I think I understand what you are saying, and we are pushed in one of the directions that Andy Fitzgibbon was talking about when he said there are some people he's going to lock up. And many of us learned from Gandhi that we prefer to have this connection with means and ends, and that be functioning in the activity. So when you start doing legislation against hate speech, and if you start confining people, obviously you are working at a secondary level to your goal, and you may make a practical decision that we are going to take these steps. But ideally, what you want to try to be able to do is to bring about the results without having to resort to the external enforcement of those. And so I think the focusing on some of these examples where we get inspiration from another discourse and hope from it, and to accentuate those to the extent that we can is part of the background. And it's going to be one that takes quite a while to bring about a culture change in which it becomes increasingly less necessary to use the apparatus of enforcement in order to stop some of the excesses that we see. But I'm not sure we'll ever entirely get away from that.
Thank you.
All right, thanks to Bill finishing a little early. I think we have time for one more quick question. So Tony?
Hi, thanks. Thanks for the paper as well. So I'm a little bit ambivalent about hope, and I just want to see what your response was, what you think of it. So I'm influenced by some Eastern philosophies which focus on non-attachment to results and focusing on the present moment, as well as Stoicism. And we all know that if you get your hopes up too much, you can get disappointed. And then maybe it draws our attention away from, it focuses us so much on the results that it's not focusing us on what we're doing. So I just wanted to see if you had a response to that, just to give me another way of looking at it.
I appreciate your sentiment, and I think it's one that a lot of people have. I don't think it does us a lot of good to think that we're going to be successful, because I think we're setting ourselves up for a disappointment. And we can say, well, what's in our power, and we can try to do that. But it may be that what our efforts are doing are not going to be the ones that take us further along. Nonetheless, ones before us have advanced us, and ones after us may do it, and we're doing our part. And we can't always be sure, but the responsibility is, do we do our part? Do what we think we can, knowing that it's possible, and hoping it'll be one that will help advance these ends towards which we're working.
Thanks. It's also valuable not to give up or to be hopeless. So that's another thought too.
Thank you, Bill. Let's give him a hand, folks. And we move to our last speaker of the session. Kate Schmidt is assistant professor at Metropolitan State in Denver. And I look forward to her talk. So you're on, and as usual, I will give you the 2-minute warning. And if you have a question for Kate, please type question in the chat, folks. You're on.
Great. Thank you so much. Those of you that have your videos on, can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me okay and the audio is all right? Thank you very much. So I just posted a handout in the chat. I don't think the handout's necessary. It's very simple, but I know some people prefer those things. So take a look if you're interested. And then I'm just going to start my timer here so that I can keep myself on track and get going. So first of all, thanks so much, Bill, for that really thoughtful talk. It's really fun to follow that, because what I wanted to speak about today is toxic hope. So Desmond Tutu said, hope is being able to see that there is light despite all of the darkness. I agree that hope has incredible importance and transformative power within a community. And I'm really grateful and excited to be part of this conference focused on hope. That being said, in my talk, I really want to focus on ways that hope can go badly and that it can be harmful to individuals and to communities. But I want to clarify, it's not because I'm against all hope. I think, in fact, that taking kind of a philosopher's approach, I want to look at the edge case. So I want to understand, what is the circumstance where hope does not function correctly? How does it go wrong? How does it go badly? And I think this is then informative into the value and the power of hope, kind of when it functions in a healthy way in our lives. So my thesis is roughly what I just said, that hope is not always a good thing. Specifically, there's such a thing as what I'm calling toxic hope, which is detrimental to individuals and to groups. it's going to be emotionally and morally beneficial for all of us to avoid this toxic hope, even if it means that we're missing out on an optimistic emotion. So I want to start with the concept of toxic positivity, which I think is something that many people might have heard or been familiar with. It's pretty common in pop culture writings, which is when can kind of optimism and positivity go too far? When can this become a problem? I'm not aware of very much technical philosophy work on toxic positivity, but there have been psychologists who have started to study it. And so I'm going to turn to them for a definition. So the one that I prefer is toxic positivity is the concept that keeping positive and keeping positive only is the right way to live your life. So perhaps you could picture like an overly optimistic coworker, right? That every day is like, don't complain, stay positive, let's get to work. Or perhaps a friend or a family member that when you're talking to them, they say, well, focus on the positive, focus on the good, just keep going. So this toxic positivity is going to involve, I think, an overall kind of mindset, maybe some behaviors and motivations, but at least part of what it's going to involve is also these emotions and emotional tendencies. And so toxic hope is going to be an element of this. So one thing about toxic positivity, when it feels like positivity goes too far, is it can be relentless. And so that can end up feeling annoying and just difficult to be around. Another thing that's problematic about it is it can end up being linked to social norms. So it feels like you're not really allowed to go against it. So in social interactions, this can end up feeling rude or dismissive or feel like a failure of empathy. But the other thing that can feel really significant about toxic positivity is the denial and suppression of negative emotions. And I'm going to argue that this is the important feature that we need to attend to, both in toxic positivity and with toxic hope. So, and this is from another psychology source, one way you might notice that yourself or someone else is kind of falling into a habit of toxic positivity, which is, again, you could be overgeneralizing this like happy, optimistic state across every situation. So this can start to involve masking other feelings, which can include kind of stifling or dismissing an emotion to sort of just get on with it. Over time, this could result for yourself in perhaps feeling guilty that you're having negative thoughts, like why can't I just be positive? Why can't I just be optimistic? Or if this transfers onto other people, you might end up minimizing their experiences, right? By trying to move quickly to the optimistic quote or kind of the feel-good motivation. Or perhaps you're kind of trying to say like, well, remember, things could be worse, when what they were looking for perhaps was empathy. And in really extreme situations, this could turn into kind of shaming or chastising others for expressing their feelings, right? Why are you complaining? Why are you being a Debbie Downer? Like, don't be that way. So I say all of this to give a sketch of what I take to be toxic positivity, and it being this kind of orientation towards optimism that occurs at the expense of other sorts of emotional expressions. So the first thing I want to talk about then, I have 3 points for those of you that haven't looked at the handout. The first point then is, can we distinguish between subspecies of hope? And I want to figure out what is kind of a healthy hope as opposed to a toxic hope that's going to go along with this sort of toxic positivity approach. In this talk, I'm thinking of hope as an emotion as opposed to a mood. So a mood is kind of affectively general and amorphous, whereas an emotion is actually trying to represent the world in a certain way or represent some meaning onto a situation. In general, philosophers who speak about hope and speak about fittingness conditions, when is hope fitting, mention 2 different elements. One is that you're thinking of the object of hope, whether it's a situation, a person, a scenario, whatever it is, as valuable and desirable. And then the other element is that it's uncertain or unlikely. For example, if you're hoping that P, you can express this as you have both a desire that P and a belief that P is possible, although not certain. Some philosophers think that there might be other fittingness conditions or elements to hope. Perhaps you need to actively imagine the thing that you're hoping for. Perhaps there's a sort of commitment element or some motivation and planning that goes along with it. I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm just going to point out that as far as I can tell, everyone does agree on those first 2 main elements. And so I think this explains part of the way hope can function interpersonally is it can be an effective cheer up message, because when you're expressing hope, you're affirming those two features. You're saying, hey, this is a thing that could happen, right? I'm affirming this uncertainty and I'm affirming its desirability. Wouldn't this just be great if this happened? And so when we express healthy hope, I think those are two of the things that we're affirming. So I want to distinguish hope from toxic hope, but the other thing I want to talk about is false hope, because I think this is different. So false hope, I'm defining as unfitting hope. So false hope would be when you have the emotion, but the circumstances in fact don't match the fittingness conditions. So for example, it would be false hope if there's not a chance of something happening. You think, oh, perhaps maybe there's a chance, but in fact, it's certain it won't happen. And so in this case, the hope would be unfitting. It's not matching the conditions. And I think colloquially, we would also call it a false hope. And the reason false hope is bad is because it's inaccurately presenting the odds in some way. And so it's representing things badly to you. I think an example in kind of popular media is often in movies and TV shows, someone's loved one is like in the hospital and they're like, well, don't give them false hope. Like don't give the family false hope that their loved one's gonna fully recover. Like that's not a possibility anymore. And so the reason why I think this is important, again, is I want to separate out false hope, which I think is criticizable because it doesn't meet these fittingness conditions. It's inappropriate. In the case of false hope, it might be true that something's desirable, but it's no longer true that there's an uncertain chance of it happening. And so it's unfitting in that sense. Toxic hope, however, I think is a genuine form of hope, which is going to make it trickier to identify and avoid the difficult harms. So toxic hope, I think, is fitting. We can have toxic hope about something that's desirable and uncertain. So the thing that seems problematic about toxic hope is that it ends up neglecting or minimizing the unhoped for outcome. So the way that toxic hope kind of warps our perception of the world is through a hyper focus on a single outcome. And so this is the core component of toxic positivity that's shared in this emotion. That toxic hope is a misrepresentation of the world because it doesn't adequately represent the distribution of values and commitments across the different scenarios. So that being said, I'm going to try to give an example to motivate some intuitions of what toxic hope might be like. So you all remember the Me Too movement on Twitter, #MeToo. There was also a #MeTooPhD, where women would talk about their experiences with discrimination or harassment or assault within the academy. And so while many people responded positively and supportively to these movements, I think you also saw responses that were categorized as toxic positivity or toxic hope. So in particular, one sort of response was, well, things are going to get better in the academy. Like, it's okay, we're going to do better going forward. Women aren't going to be harassed going forward. So let's be hopeful about how great our academy is going to be. Another sort of hopeful response would be, well, you know, you can get your degree, you can get your PhD, and then you can kind of show all the haters that you succeeded. Like, you can do it. And I think these are expressions of hope. They're saying, look, wouldn't it be great if these things happened? And they could happen. But I think intuitively, many of us can also see how they come across as sort of tone deaf, rude, and potentially minimizing the experiences that women within the academy were having or were trying to share in these circumstances. That, yes, that's true, perhaps the academy will suddenly get better and this won't occur anymore. And that would be great if that happened, but also maybe now is not the time to bring that up. So that's a sort of example of what I take to be a fitting expression of hope, but one that's functioning in a toxic way. All right, so my next point is going to connect kind of more directly to the literature on epistemic injustice. And so I think that one way we can understand how hope is toxic interpersonally is that toxic hope can function as a testimonial injustice. So this is not to say that every expression of toxic hope is a testimonial injustice. I don't think that's the case, but I think some expressions of toxic hope can function this way. toxic expressions of hope can end up being dismissive to the people that you're talking to. And so they can represent, a failure to listen sympathetically or empathetically. So if my friend is coming to me for like, yeah, that sucks, and I say, nah, be hopeful, I think we can all see how socially I've kind of made a misstep, I've been rude. But in some cases, I think it goes farther than that. So a testimonial injustice, if you're unfamiliar, is when a person's knowledge, specifically their knowledge given during testimony, is downgraded in credibility because of a social identity prejudice. So this is a sort of form of oppression in our knowledge practices. The classic example is if a woman gives some testimony and someone doesn't believe that woman because they hold the belief that like women are too emotional. And so they take the woman's testimony maybe not seriously at all, or maybe they just take it less seriously than they should. And so this is an injustice in the way that this woman is treated, and it's happening within the context of testimony. So feelings of hope and positivity, when they are expressed from one person to another interpersonally, can be a way to do this same sort of moral harm. They can function as a way to undermine or sometimes even directly silence the testimony and the knowledge of others by silencing their emotional expressions. And when this happens along the line of oppressed and socially marginalized identities, it is functioning to downgrade the knowledge of others. And so it is functioning as a testimonial injustice. So through this sort of emotional policing, then individuals, the ones who are being silenced, they're not able to express their knowledge or share their experiences, to share with their emotions, their perception of the world that the emotions are representing, right? And so when this happens, it's functioning in this way. For example, imagine I'm a woman in the workforce, and at a board meeting, my ideas are always getting shut down. I feel like no one listens to me because I'm the junior woman and no one's taking my ideas seriously. So I go and complain to my male friend and I say, oh my gosh, all my ideas at work get shot down. No one thinks they're real ideas. And my friend says, like, be positive, stay hopeful. It's gonna get better. Like, as you have more time at the job, they're gonna start listening to you. It's not that bad. You gotta stay positive at work, okay? So of course you could see how like this person's being an unhelpful friend. But I think you can also see with this example that this is a testimonial injustice, because by dismissing my frustration, my emotion in the expression of hope and saying I should have hope, he's either completely ignoring my reasons or dismissing my reasons for pessimism. Like, I have reasons for thinking things at my workplace won't get better. And so when you say be hopeful, you're dismissing those reasons. Or again, it doesn't have to be an outright dismissal, it could just be a downgrading. In either case, if this dismissal occurs along gendered grounds, right, maybe he just thinks women are too sensitive when pitching their ideas in a business environment, and so I shouldn't take it so hard and be so negative, that's a testimonial injustice, right? Because it's undermining my position to actually know what my experience means, to know that it means my ideas aren't likely to be heard in the future. So I've just given a detailed interpersonal example with gender, but I do think another important example along these lines for race is kind of the experience that many people of color in this country have had with Trump and with Trump being elected. That many people who were upset, panicked when Trump was elected were kind of told, don't overreact, don't be so worried. One president for 4 years can't do that much to encourage white supremacy, can't do that much to damage race relations, right? And many of them, after the events of this month, 4 years, I'll just gesture after things, have said, look, my pessimism was really, really justified. And when it's particularly white men and white women who are saying, be hopeful, be positive, just get into organizing and be ready to hit the ground running in 4 years, that's dismissive. And when it functions along the lines of race and the lines of privilege, it's dismissive in a way that blocks out the knowledge and experiences of others, which again is textbook epistemic testimonial injustice. Okay. So that's one central point that I want to make about how this toxic hope can function. But I also want to say that we can't solve this problem by just never expressing our hope. Because here's one thing I could do. I could just say, well, I just won't tell other people to be hopeful, and then I'll avoid this problem of this toxic positivity and toxic hope. Unfortunately, I think that toxic hope can also function as a sort of internalized gaslighting. So even if you don't share hope with others, if you become over-identified with it or have this kind of hope that is, again, kind of myopically focused on one outcome, it's psychologically bad for you. So returning briefly to psychology, it is bad to suppress and ignore your negative feelings. If you deny and minimize and repress your negative feelings, for one thing, it can lead to denial and you're no longer having accurate perceptions of the world. But for another thing, it's harmful to your mental health and over time harmful to your physical health. So this can also, when it occurs in kind of a structured way, or when you're intaking toxic hope from other people, this can be sort of a form of gaslighting. So if you're unfamiliar with the term, Abramson defines gaslighting as a form of emotional manipulation in which the gaslighter tries, whether consciously or not, to induce in someone the sense that her reactions, perceptions, memories, and/or beliefs are not just mistaken, but utterly without grounds. And so this is a way of undermining people's epistemic standing by making them doubt their own experiences and assessments. And so doubting and suppressing your own emotions can also function in this way. So if you tell yourself things will just get better in a bad job or in a bad relationship, this can be a form of sort of gaslighting yourself if you're not being aware of and responsive to your actual reasons.
2 minutes.
Great, thank you. So with the gaslighting, I want to point out, one, that's irrational to disregard your own actual reasons and experiences, and two, it can be dangerous. So some psychologists in London were studying survivors of domestic violence and looking at not hope specifically, but positivity in general. And one thing they found is that optimism can skew your risk assessment, so your perception of your chance of experiencing abuse, and also the likelihood of someone returning to an abuser. So being positive can be very dangerous in terms of you becoming yourself self-deceived. So the last thing I want to say is, how do we avoid this toxic hope? I think that hope is very important and we do need to be pursuing its benefits, but I want to avoid this sort of warped version. So one issue is to be aware of power dynamics within our knowledge practices. So careful whose opinions, experiences, ideas you're dismissing and why, and be careful with that in terms of avoiding the testimonial injustice. So that means we all have to be aware of our privileges based on race or socioeconomic status or whatever it is. But the other thing that I think is really significant is creating space for negative emotions, both your own and the negative emotions of other people. So Michael Brady has argued that the fittingness conditions for hope and despair have the same elements. He says, quote, "The fact that an event is desirable but unlikely seems a reason to hope that it occurs. But by the same token, the fact that it is desirable but unlikely also seems a reason for despairing about its occurring," end quote. And so when we think about how to better listen to one another, hold space for one another, and be in solidarity with one another, we need to recognize this can't require the absence of negativity. Non-toxic hope is going to require being aware of the stakes of a situation, which means not neglecting or trying to silence or dismiss the possible negative consequences or the negative emotions that go along with it. So when we're seeking solidarity with each other, I hope that we can also consider, how do we share our negative emotions and who can we trust with our despair? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kate. We've got a few deferrals, so I'll start with Macy Salzberger. You have a question, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much. I really enjoyed that talk. I don't really have a question, I just have a comment. In case you haven't run across the work of Katie Stockdale, she has a paper that I think would be a really useful complement, which is called "Losing Hope, Injustice, and Moral Bitterness." And so she talks about the legitimacy of bitterness as an appropriate moral attitude that can in fact usefully inform our perceptions of the world. So that's all, thanks again.
Thank you very much, I appreciate that.
Great. Okay, then we'll move to Stephen De Lorenzo.
Thanks for the wonderful talk. In my professional sphere, we have a saying that says, hope is not a course of action. So the way it works is like, if I go to my boss and I say, I hope X will happen, my boss will say, hope is not a course of action. And he's trying to insult me and say that you should do contingency planning. Is this a kind of toxic hope, or is this something in the realm of what you're gesturing at?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. So what I want to identify in terms of, like I said, I think toxic hope is hope. It does meet the fittingness conditions, but what's different is the way that it functions is to kind of warp one's focus or attention only onto the desired outcome. So I think the way to combat this is to allow space for considering the unwanted outcome, which I think is what you're suggesting with like the contingency planning of, if I care about something and I'm hopeful about it, that also means I recognize I'm committed to being really hurt and upset if these other things happen. And so it's also worth considering those outcomes and my commitments to those outcomes. So I think that's a nice way to put it, that we also kind of can focus on different action points with the different scenarios as a way of not becoming overly focused. So thanks.
Great. Okay, Will Barnes.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you, Kate. I think that was very interesting, utterly compelling. I agree with all the cases you're describing as being something unhelpful and negative. But I think I need some clarification to see why they are actually examples of hope rather than sort of using hope as a means of gaslighting. So in your examples, it seems to me that the people dismissing the negative experiences and the totally legitimate complaints by saying you should be optimistic and you should hope, that is not an example of hope. It's using that term as a way to just simply gaslight somebody. So then my question would be, is that then parasitic on our general positive evaluation of hope? Is that the way it works? Is that when you use that word hope, the reason that it actually has that unjust effect is because of our collective beliefs that that's a necessarily positive thing, in which case, is that where the toxicity of hope actually lies? I guess what I'm trying to understand is, I don't really see how those are examples of hope. Great. They're just
So I think I can at least clarify that. I'm not sure I fully can address the second half of the question. I do think that toxic hope is hope, which is worrying and troubling because then it's harder to avoid it. So I was picturing in the scenario, say where I complain to my male friend about not being listened to at work. Let's assume my male friend is not in fact trying to gaslight me, but is just kind of oblivious or not being that careful. And so there's no malice on his part when he says, oh, be positive, I'm sure they'll listen to your ideas next time. It seems to me that this is almost a paradigmatic case where hope would be fitting. There is a chance they listen to my ideas next time. We don't know for sure. I've judged that it's a low chance, but there is a chance. So it meets that criteria. And that would be really desirable. I do really, really want to be listened to. So that's part of why I give the fittingness conditions there, because it seems like we can't say that doesn't meet one of those two conditions. I do find it really desirable that I'm listened to next time. I do think there's a chance. And at the same time, I really wanted my friend to acknowledge my disappointment and frustration rather than to express this toxic hope. So that's what I was trying to illustrate and why I think this is a case where hope is fitting. And that also means that like I have to be careful in the future when I express hope, even if it's fitting, it might be harmful interpersonally. Does that help a little bit?
Yes, thank you.
Well, judging by the list of people who want to ask you a question in the chat, Kate, I don't think it's a toxic hope to say that, you know, there's a lot of people hoping to talk to you.
I just put my email in the chat if you didn't get a chance to look at the handout. I would welcome further thoughts on this as it's a young project for me.
Yeah, young, but very, I think it's great. Okay, I mean, so with that being said, we're out of time. So I don't know, maybe Court can reestablish things. If Kate wants to talk more, I don't know, I'll leave that up to him. But we're out of time. I will remind everyone that our estimable president, Paula Smithka, is going to give the presidential address. So you should come back at 5:30 Central Time, but on the other link, right? And
Right.
with that, everyone give Kate a hand.
Yeah.
And
And
I'll
there's a
turn it over
business
to
meeting
Court.
coming up that
Thank
all are
you, Bob.
welcome to attend, and especially if you like hanging out with us and want to do more or just hang out more. We're going to meet here in this room at 4 o'clock. And if y'all want to keep talking for a little bit, you can. That's fine. But business meeting here in a couple minutes.
Hang out, stay for our business meeting. We're so fun. You should come hang out with us.